Hey, Vanessa.
Hey, Decca. Welcome to New York City.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those of you who do not know, I have just relocated here to get my PhD in historic preservation from Columbia.
Yeah, as if you didn't know already, Decca is a badass academic. So yeah, way to go.
Thank you. I'm trying. I'm pretty excited to be here and learn from some of the most innovative people in preservation and equitable development today.
Yes, they're just crawling around Columbia, I'm sure.
And
And speaking of incredible people in equitable development, today we have an amazing guest. One of my, I think, favorite people on the planet, actually.
yeah, I've only met Rukaiyah a few times, but I very much feel that too. So, as I said, today we have none other than the brilliant Rukaiyah Adams.
I first met Rukaiyah in Portland, Oregon a few years ago. That was back when I was working on the City of the Future podcast, and I was producing a season all about ideas and development that could make cities more equitable.
At the time, Rukaiyah was an investment banker on the board of the Albina Vision Trust, an organization set up to redevelop the historically Black neighborhood of Albina, Portland, where Rukaiyah grew up. The Albina Vision Trust estimated that after decades of urban renewal and displacement, the neighborhood's former Black residents had lost about $1 billion in wealth.
Yeah, I mean, it was a ton of lost money in that neighborhood. So what I wanted to talk to her about when I went out there was this idea that they were hoping to implement in the Albina project, which was a neighborhood real estate investment trust, or a REIT, which is kind of complicated. But if you want to know more about it, you can check out that City of the Future episode. I think it's episode 17. Yes, episode 17. And you can learn more about it.
So, Vanessa, if you could, in a nutshell, just tell us what a REIT is.
I'll try in a nutshell. We did do like a whole episode, so it's hard. But my understanding is, like for most people in this country, the primary way that you access wealth over time is through like owning your home, right? Owning property. That's like the American dream, right? But so many people nowadays cannot afford to own property, especially if you live in a neighborhood that's like gentrifying or it's having a lot of development. And so you're kind of locked out of that wealth generation for you and any future generations that you would pass on that wealth to. So the idea of a real estate investment trust or a REIT is like, what if you could buy essentially a share in the neighborhood? And so over time, as the neighborhood grows, as development comes into the neighborhood, as profits are generated from these projects, then you would actually generate some wealth, and you'd basically be investing in your neighborhood's success and generating wealth over time. So I believe that's the concept in a nutshell.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Right. That was quite a lot to unpack. So
yeah,
people should maybe go. So maybe folks should just listen to this episode and then, listen to the City of the Future episode, and then they will become a professional on understanding what REITs are. Yeah. Since that conversation that you had with Rukaiyah, though, she's been pretty busy.
Yeah.
She and the Albina Vision Trust are further along in their plans for Albina, as you will all hear in this episode. And she's founded the 1803 Fund, which is like really, really cool. She has already raised $400 million from Phil and Penny Knight. And she's just like keeps going. It's incredible.
Yes. And I think that money is going to go to Albina, but also other projects that she talks about. So it's awesome. Rukaiyah is awesome. I should probably just stop telling you how great she is, because I could do that forever. I'd just let her speak for herself. So we should probably just get to this interview.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. But before we get to the interview, we should mention that we discussed Vanport in this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So maybe people need a little primer, but for those who missed our trailer, which we aired in May, a bit backstory about Vanport. It was a temporary wartime housing campus, basically a city built on the floodplain between Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon during World War II.
Right. It was made so that the workers of Kaiser shipyards could come work on the ships for the war effort and also live nearby with their families. And it attracted workers from across the country. It was white Americans, Black Americans, Japanese Americans, Indigenous Americans, all stripes.
And surprisingly, only the residential areas were segregated. The common areas and the schools were integrated, which was very unusual for the time period.
Yeah, especially in Oregon, which was a very segregated place, right?
And the diversity did help create a pretty tight-knit community there.
Unfortunately, however, in 1948, the community was essentially wiped out in moments by a massive flood.
Most of the Black folks in Vanport ended up moving to Albina. So the two locations have pretty strong ties, which Rukaiyah explains beautifully in this interview.
And we are currently working with a nonprofit, Vanport Mosaic, to create a podcast about Vanport and the experiences of its Black, Japanese, and Indigenous American residents and descendants. And hopefully we'll weave the story of Albina into that work as well.
Yeah. And we're currently fundraising for that project. So if you personally want to support us, please consider donating to our nonprofit, Urbanist Media, at PayPal or Venmo. That's at Urbanist Media, one word. Or if you know of an organization or entity that would like to sponsor the Vanport series, you can also email us at urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com.
Okay, I think we covered it. So without further ado, please enjoy our conversation with Rukaiyah Adams. Hi, Rukaiyah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey.
We're really excited to talk to you today. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing you before in Portland. So I think we're going to kind of pick up where some of those previous conversations left off, maybe rehash a little bit for people who aren't as familiar with your work or didn't listen to those episodes of City of the Future. And then I'm very excited to get updates of what you've been doing since then. So before we get too deep into it, would you mind just introducing yourself to folks who may not know you or know what your work is about? Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. My name is Rukaiyah Adams. I am in the fourth of 7 generations of my family in Portland, so I'm a Portlander to place me on the planet. My brief description of myself is that I'm a bossy middle-aged lady, an unapologetically bossy middle-aged lady.
That's where I'm headed, hopefully.
Middle age is amazing, Vanessa.
Yeah? Okay,
amazing.
good.
Yeah, oh my God. As long as you kind of lean into it, don't resist it. I mean,
Yeah.
and around your age, you have to choose what kind of middle-aged lady you're going to be. Like, are you going to be the keep it sexy forever lady? Are you going to be the plant lady or the cat lady or whatever? I decided pretty early I was going to be a plant lady.
Nice.
Anyway,
Bossy plant lady.
Bossy plant lady.
Yeah, I've spent most of my professional life as an investor and think of myself as someone who thinks deeply about capital and society.
Okay, we're going to definitely dive into those topics. But I remember from our previous conversation, you had a really interesting story about leaving Portland and returning to Portland. So would you mind just recapping why you felt like you had to leave and why you felt like you had to come back?
Sure. So growing up in Portland, it was a delightful place to grow up because it's a big enough city to be interesting, but small enough that, everywhere you go, you'll see someone you know. The downside of that is when you get to an age of independence, 16, 17, all of a sudden it feels small. And at that time, it seemed not Black enough, to be frank. So I left at 17 when I went to college and said, I'm never coming back to this one-horse town. If I never see a rainy winter again in my life, it would be great.
And just to clarify, was your community not Black at all? Like, were you one of the only Black folks in where you lived, or was it just that the community itself was very small?
Yeah, the community was small. No, when I lived in Portland, when I was a kid in Portland, I lived in what was like a little Black and brown community. So it was Black folks, Mexicans, Pacific Islanders, and other immigrants from Vietnam and different parts of the world. As they plugged into Portland, they would usually move into what was the historic Black community. So it was very diverse, but mostly Black. But it was a small community. So at the time I was a kid here, there was a lot of white supremacist violence here. And so there were clear boundaries where Black kids could be in the city and be safe. So it just felt so cloistered and small. And as I got to an age where I wanted to push the boundaries of responsibility and independence, it just was such a small city that I really couldn't get away from people I knew. It was just really small, and I wanted something bigger. So I left for 23 years, lived in a bunch of other cities, and came to middle age, and all of a sudden the things that I disliked about Portland, either they had changed over the ensuing 20 plus years, or I had changed. What seemed to be kind of a sleepy town had sort of picked up a bit, and I was in my, approaching 40, and I was slowing down a bit. And the idea of living in New York City, all of a sudden it felt out of whack with where I was in my life. And then you get to that point, you also want to commit to a place and be about a place. And Although I loved living in San Francisco and Oakland and New York, I never really understood the people of those places. I understood Black history writ large and could plug into the Black community in New York. But what I realized upon coming home was that I am these crazy people in this town with their naked bike rides and their, ferrets in a basket, and they're my people. And I also grew old enough and powerful enough to integrate two identities that when I was young, I really struggled to integrate. And those would be being an Oregonian and being an African American, being culturally African American. And what I have come to learn is that the Blackest place in the world is wherever I am. And so I don't really need the same kinds of cultural markers that I did when I was a young adult. So I came back home after 23 years, and it was a challenge because I had moved into a different economic class. The food I ate changed. How I recreated changed. What I read changed. And so there were so many differences between the kid who left, who had grown up in public housing, and the Juris Doctorate who came back home as an executive.
So when you came back home, was it to the same community that you had left?
No. Good question. No, that community had been gentrified and dispersed and pushed to the edges of the city. When I was a kid, North and Northeast Portland were pretty clearly Black and brown, and there were police officers and teachers and all different kinds of people who lived in this community. Well, by the time I came back, that community had been largely dispersed, not entirely, but largely. The residential component of the community, the cultural centers and communities serving organizations that own their real estate, they remained in North and Northeast Portland. So people still come to this part of the city to be in communion, but more than half of the population got distributed. So it was significantly smaller.
This reminds me of, we've done a few episodes and collaborations with folks working on Black churches, and a lot of historical Black churches, the community isn't even necessarily around them anymore, and they have to kind of commute in for Sunday or commute in for special events. And it kind of seems maybe similar in that people were dispersed and there might be a community event and then people all regather. But I would imagine that over time, fewer and fewer people make that trek, people go even further, and the sense of togetherness starts to fade.
Right. And, there are these complex tensions between redlining and group identity and, culture. And so if the dispersal of the community had been that people had made enough money and had enough resources and opportunities to disperse, that would be one thing. In this case, it was the intentional racist distribution of what was a concentrated Black community. It was intentional. And so that part of it, the intentionality that's reflected in city council minutes and policy and resource inventories, that part of it makes it pretty nefarious. Anyway, I came home to a transformed community, and it was crazy to see the changes through the eyes of an investor.
What does that mean? How do you see differently through the eyes of an investor?
What I think people from the outside would have perceived as a poor, blighted community, I came home to see houses in disrepair because that was the only capital asset families had to fund college, for example. Or if I know a family had someone who was sick or needed home care that was really expensive, what they were essentially using was real estate as their only capital asset to finance services that were necessary, whether they're education or healthcare. So the dilapidated look and texture of the community I recognized as essentially a result of undercapitalized families playing out visually in the landscape. I also started to see that businesses that I thought of as predatory, and maybe they are, form or perform a specific set of services. For example, pawn shops, which when I was a kid, I hated. I hated all the pawn shops in our community. Well, I had someone die who was near my mom's age when I first moved back, and he essentially used the pawn shop as his trust agent to distribute his estate of, things at the end of his life, which weren't of like serious significance, but they were things like cars and fur coats and watches and things like that. So what I came to see was that the pawn agent was acting like a trust service for the community. I could also see the informal banking relationships that were playing out in the community. So all these financial mechanisms that we've put formal words on, I could see them playing out in the community that I grew up in much more informal arrangements.
Decca, do you want to ask the next question? I feel like I've asked a lot of questions so far.
No, the next questions that we have, I feel like, are about Vanport. From the last time that we spoke, you said Vanport was in your DNA. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, to be a Black Portlander whose family, has been here for 7 generations, you're connected to that history. So Vanport was actually the second settlement of Black folks in Portland. The initial settlement was in Northwest Portland, it was a community that was adjacent to the train station where a lot of Pullman porters worked. So those folks, when they were sort of squeezed out of Northwest Portland, moved to Vanport. Vanport was a city outside of the technical boundaries of Portland at the time, and it was essentially an affordable housing development. It was affordable because it was placed in the floodplain of the Columbia River and the Willamette River. In fact, it's at the intersection of the two. And I'm sure your listeners know the story. In the late 40s, the 1,000-year flood that we always feared happened. And the people who lived in that community were essentially pushed out immediately. It was deadly and terrifying and horrible. And they moved from what was Vanport to Albina. And Albina is another community that we're focused on that's in the floodplain of the Willamette River. So to be a Black Portlander is to be historically and personally connected to the flood at Vanport and the flow of people out of Vanport into Albina, from Albina up through Killingsworth, and now pushed out to the Numbers. And I think the imagery of a flood, the kind of the violent alluvial overtaking of spaces, that is what it feels like to be a Black Portlander, to be in motion and sort of moved around. And so the work we're doing now in 1803 is kind of the opposite of that. It's recognizing we're in the first generation of Black Americans who will have the authority and resources to say, I'm not moving anywhere. You're not pushing me out. You're not selling me. I ain't migrating. I don't care about gentrification. The responsibility and privilege of safeguarding this place, its land and flora and fauna and animals, that responsibility and privilege is mine. And that's a pretty radical thing to say to descendants of enslaved peoples.
Yeah, this is all things we're going to absolutely talk to you more about in the work that you're doing now. But I do just want to keep reflecting on Vanport for a little bit, especially this idea of the flood and dispersal and how that is a pattern that repeats. There's like the natural waters that push people out, but there's also the man-made decisions that allow for people to be at the mercy of nature, right? And these are not natural disasters; they are man-made disasters. And this idea that you're saying the flood is both factual and also metaphorical, because peoples get moved and moved and moved. And like, as you were telling from your own story, you've witnessed that in your one lifetime, but it doesn't take very far back to go 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and you see it's something that happens again and again and again and again.
Yeah, but I think what we're doing is taking back this idea of a floodplain. We think of Vanport, the flood, as this destructive force that broke a community, and that is true. But there are upsides to floods, right? The fertility that comes with the spreading of soil and nutrients through the flooding process. There's the dispersal of seeds and ideas throughout a floodplain. And what I'm coming to see now that my family's been here long enough is that Vanport dispersed seeds. And now they're taking root.
How would you describe the Vanport story in terms of which identities it kind of touched upon?
Yeah, so again, Vanport was not just a man-made disaster because of the flood, but it was fundamentally an affordable housing development, which is really jarring to say that we have all these folks who work in labor, shipbuilding in the region that drive our economy, and we put them in this really dangerous place to live. The people who lived there were not even majority Black. It was actually a diverse community of Black folks, mostly working class white people. There were Asian American families who lived there. So it was actually a really diverse community. That what got wiped out was a peaceful, cohabitating, diverse community. That's what we've wiped out. The reason why I think these incidents, particularly in Portland, whether it's Albina or Vanport, get characterized as Black is because Black folks have played a particular role in moral clarity, right? Black people who lived in Vanport testified to the effect. We talk about the impact on community, whereas the white folks who lived in the community after World War II, many of them were of Eastern European descent, Germans, as was the case in Albina. And after Germany lost World War II, those people wanted to blend into the broader white population in Portland. And so they didn't like to hearken back to these experiences of living in diverse communities. They just wanted to blend in and not stick out. Whereas, so they could kind of blend into the pervasive whiteness or lightness of the city, whereas we stayed Black and continued to tell our stories. And so sometimes people just get confused. I mean, you probably know better than I do, but I would guess it was less than 40% Black. The other interesting thing about Vanport is that that's where Portland State University was. So it was Vanport City College. And it was moved to its current location downtown after the flood. And it was always a kind of underfunded university that needed more support, and it still is to this day compared to the University of Oregon or Oregon State University. So we have deep connections with our university system in Vanport and deep connections to Albina, the community that would grow out of the Vanport flood. That was another of those diverse communities where we had pretty much equal proportions of different kinds of people. And again, I think the deepest fear in some parts of the country that want to prevent us from forming a kind of collective identity was a diverse, multiracial community. And that's what we eliminated in Vanport.
After the war, and most people left, so between the war and the flood, it was about 1/3 African American, and actually that's the thought process that I wanted to kind of hear more about from you about what and how that story is connected, to you and your experiences, but really also specific to the Albina area. Because I believe you have connections to the Albina area yourself. Could you explain a little bit about, what happened after the flood in terms of the population dispersal back into Portland and the African-American groups that ended up coming to Albina? And I mean, were there other minority groups that utilized and came into the Albina area as well?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. There are 3 populations in Portland that have been intimately connected historically that we don't talk about openly. The first is the African-American population and the Eastern European white population. Sometimes those folks were Jewish, sometimes they were German, but those were a lot of the young servicemen who were white who lived in Vanport. If you ask them what their ethnic background was, many of them were of Eastern European descent. There were also a lot of Japanese Americans who were there. And the combination of Japanese immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, and Black migrants from the South, the reason why those groups were there and needed affordable housing is that Portland's economy was transforming from a really natural resource-driven economy to an industrial economy between 1920, say, and 1960. And the economy needed welders and, the skilled tradesmen that were around the world. And so that's how we attracted Eastern European technical people and the Black migrants out of the South. Almost all those men were Pullman porters or welders or shipbuilders and technical people of one kind or another.
Right. And I would imagine that that's partly why Portland was booming, was because where it was like geographically located and by those deep rivers, I would imagine that there were kind of like big ships coming in and out, right, at that time?
That's right. So our waterways are the thing that enabled the economy to transform into an industrial economy, but it also made life in the city really tough for poor people. So you know about the flood in Vanport. Well, Albina at the time was in the floodplain of the Willamette River. Albina is just east of Vanport, essentially, straight east on the Willamette. And that was in the floodplain of the river. So there were these Black workers, shipbuilders, living on the edge of the waterway and building things that were sent out into global markets using the waterway. So the rivers are a really important part of being Black, and that's the connection of Vanport and Albina. Here's the other thing, Decca. Many of the folks whose families moved here with the wave that mine did, although Black folks have been here from the beginning, okay? So York was Black. The general manager for Hudson's Bay Company was of Caribbean descent. Black folks have been here long before statehood. But in the big wave of us, folks came from North Louisiana, Oklahoma, and North Texas. And they came from that part of the country because that's where Black men were trained in these specific trades that were valuable in World War I, Korea, and World War II that also were very valuable in shipbuilding. So they migrate, and they literally, like my family, left the Red River in Louisiana where they would supplement their diet with fishing and, sort of country farming, and ran west and tumbled to the east bank of the Willamette River. And it was the river and its similarity to the Red River in Texas that really attracted a lot of people to the region. So ironically, the biggest danger and the biggest magnet were the same. And also it's interesting, the Willamette River, the lower Willamette, the part that's in Portland, is a Superfund site.
Today, because of the industry and what it left behind.
So in addition to, being in the floodplain, the water in 1930, 40, 50, 60 was horrible. We were dumping coal from a coal-fired power plant near where OMSI is today. There was shipbuilding and shards of metal dumped into the river. There are old images of Portland where there were things called scow villages where poor, mostly white people actually lived on the river. So their waste flowed directly into the river. So it was really not an awesome place to live. Like if you had any money, you want to be away from the river. So it's this interesting connection that we have to it.
Yeah, I think so Deck and I went to Portland in May to go to the Vanport Mosaic Festival, which they do every May to memorialize the flood and also to celebrate the stories and the descendants. And I took her basically on the same route that you took me when we went the year prior. And I don't know if you remember, but there's like a picture. I think we used it as the art for the episode, but there's a picture of you and me on that bridge, right? And so I took Deck on that bridge, and we looked over to the right, and I'm sure you also have this like vividly in your mind's eye, but there's these like silos, these train tracks, and piles of what we assumed was coal. And we looked over, and I was explaining like, this, spoiler alert for this episode, but this is what Rukaiyah is working on. She's going to transform this area, this whole Albina neighborhood, and it's hard to imagine what can be when you're looking at something so industrial and it had a smell, like an odor, And one of the things we really wanted to talk to you about was like, how do you recover a land that has been so abused, for lack of a better term, by industry, right? By human activity that has not taken nature into account and certainly hasn't taken the human population into account that is like cohabiting with this industry. And so, I mean, maybe this is kind of a segue to start talking about some of the work that you're going to be doing with Albina Vision Trust. But yeah, how do you think about that legacy of industry and how to rehabilitate lands that, right now are kind of, aren't really fit for human habitation?
Yes. Oh gosh, this conversation we're going to wander here a little bit.
Yeah.
For years, we tried to make the case for the redevelopment of Albina based on economics.
And maybe actually it's worth going back a little bit and explaining to folks like how that all started for you when you started to think about the redevelopment of Albina in the first place. Actually, if
I've
you
been
don't
thinking
mind.
about it. Yeah, girl, I've been thinking about this my whole life.
Yeah.
I said at 17 I wanted to get the heck out of this one horse
Mm-hmm.
town, but the town never left me. And as I
Mm.
made my way around the world, I started to think, why can't we do that in Portland? I went to college near Minneapolis, and there were all these interesting things in downtown Minneapolis, skyways and walkways and other ways of engaging the city without being on the street level in the rain. So I started thinking about it then. I studied in Chicago as an undergraduate, studied affordable housing and public housing and the dismantling of Cabrini Green and the effect that had on the Black community there. And so I remember sitting in Chicago in the 90s. At that time, Nicole Hannah-Jones was a beat reporter for one of the newspapers in Chicago. And I remember reading her writing, thinking about Portland and affordable housing, because I grew up in public housing and was noodling on it. Anyway, and then certainly by the time I made it to New York, I was living near the Harlem Children's Zone and thinking a lot about the way Harlem was transforming around the lives of children. And that was kind of the breakthrough for me mentally. And it was, of course, years later when I got to Meyer and I had the money to begin to test some of the ideas that I had, that the work really started in earnest. But the Albina Vision work started, I think, 8 years ago. We initially came together to plan the redevelopment of the area right around the Memorial Coliseum and the Moda Center, the sports facilities for Portland. I quickly took that committee over, bossy middle-aged lady style. I was like, "Oh hell no, we're not building. This is not going to become LA Live. It must reflect the community that was here." And so, over the course of years, we learned about the history, and the group slowly started to focus on redeveloping Albina, reflecting the history and deepening the connection of Black people to Portland. It took us years, Vanessa, to get there. I wouldn't say I was really clear when we started, but I'd say 2 or 3 years in, what became clear to me was that what we did to the river, we did to each other. It was polluted and disregarded, and in some ways, just what we did to our river, it's almost like pure evil. I don't know how we could ever think what we did was okay. In the same way, I don't know how we could ever think putting thousands of people in affordable housing in the floodplains of 2 converging rivers was a good thing. In the same way that I can't imagine that the kind of racism and redlining and hatred that our Black and brown communities experienced here, that we ever think that was okay. So what I'm learning is that if you ever wonder if a community is crazy and racist, look at their waterways. Because the way they treat their environment will reflect their cultural values. Anyway,
Well,
that's a long-winded way of saying I've been thinking about this for 25 years, and I'm just now in positions of power where I can do things. I can fund things. I have enough influence to say to people, hey, look at this thing. It's important. Whereas when I was younger, I was just sort of contemplating what I might do when I got to this time in my life.
that's incredible. I mean, I know I personally want to know how you got there, but we just stick on the focus of hearing what you're doing exactly and diving more into that.
Yeah, maybe picking up. You said so. You're in the committee. You're bossy lady in the committee. How do you get from there to what you're doing today?
Well, a couple things. So my great 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 grandmother, when she came here, rented an attic apartment from a German family right about where the Memorial Coliseum is today. And the day she arrived, she wrote in her Bible, "Dear God, I hope I've made the right decision in bringing my family to this place." And she was looking west over the Willamette into what is the Pearl today. And she was a garment worker. So she would every day get up, put a kerchief on her head, and either walk or ride her bike across those bridges that you guys probably crossed on your walk into Portland. And that view of the city from Albina was her view, imagining a beloved community. And something about coming back and having done well enough that I could take some financial risk. I could take some reputational risk. Coming back and realizing that this woman migrated across the country around my age, right? She was middle-aged by the time she got here, and prayed that she made the right decision, and she did. She made the right decision because 3 generations later, I have a Juris Doctorate. And I thought, if she could talk to me, what would she want from me? Now that I've done well enough, like, what is all this for? What is my education for? What is my good health for? And it's not to accumulate more shit. I can only be in one room at a time. And I don't have children. That's the other thing, is that I have time. I have some time that other women in my age group don't have. I'm getting emotional here talking to you guys. But the thing that really made me kind of take over was thinking about her life. She had a son who was killed by a police officer, which is why they left the South. She never got to go beyond 2nd grade. And she knew that our family needed a radical change. She probably wanted to engage the power structure, but couldn't. And you know what? I can.
Mm.
And so, like, all of a sudden, not doing anything was unacceptable. And not being brave, totally unacceptable. So it was that. It was imagining her.
Oh, it's so cute that you're getting emotional. I love it.
Yeah, it's so meaningful.
It's like you hear her. It's like you hear
Yeah.
her.
Yeah, and she lived a long life. So her name was Inez Davis, and this is my great-grandmother, not my great-great-grandmother, but when I was a little girl, I was a bossy little girl, and one time she called me into her living room and basically said, "Hey, I need you to stay bossy. You're gonna be my great-grandchild who goes to college and does okay." And so I just think about her life, what she saw, and that my life is even better than she could imagine. Like, it's great. I mean, it's great to have the kind of educational authority to walk into any room in the world. I'm not intimidated. I feel capable.
Oh my gosh.
I love that she told you to stay bossy. How many little girls get told to stop being bossy, right? How many little girls are like, get in line, don't speak up. Like, I love that she told you from a young age, just stay bossy, because you've lived it. Like, that's how you started.
Stayed bossy. But I grew up with a bunch of bossy, badass women. So my great-grandmother was amazing. My grandmother ran, businesses. She was basically a COO at a garment factory. My great aunt Margaret Carter was the first elected woman to the state house. Like, I grew up around a lot of women who were really bossy. So I really had nowhere to go. Like, there was no other path for me than just, like, being a badass woman. Like, the Davis girls don't play. And that's just...
Okay, so I feel
okay,
like...
back to the story. Okay.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people are like, are going to be very inspired, but they're also going to be like, but what did you do? Like, how did you do it? Because I want to do it too. Like, you're going to inspire them. We got to give them some brass tacks. How the heck did you go about from like, okay, I have a legacy here. I got to stay bossy. I have work to do.
Like, I have a background in like investment. Like, I know how things work. Yeah. Like, what did you do to really get people to start to change things?
Well, the first thing was I claimed the vote. So one thing, there's this like millennial thing that's happening where people are like, if you want to invite you to the table, bring your own chair. I'm like, no. You control the table. So what I tried to do was turn that committee into a conversation about the past. And as long as we were talking about what happened there, I was the only person in the room that had personal authority because it was my family that was there. And so once the work is rooted in a shared understanding about the past, and the people who are connected to that have a kind of authority that no one else in the room has.
Ooh, I just want to pause on that for 1 second, because a lot of times we get asked, like, what is the value of our work? Like, what is the benefit? And I don't know, Deck, if you wanted to speak to this, because I just feel like you just in a couple words just kind of establish like there is authority in surfacing and connecting with history.
Time, yes, and that is the Black experience. Is the most clear leaders know that they're on an arc, and their role is to bend it, right? And I think anchoring work in history, at least some past, gives you an awareness of the arc and makes the other people get onto your arc so that you're not in theirs, right? And so,
Right.
yeah.
But I mean, I do want to also pick apart something else that you said, because you were like, you were the only one who had the personal connection. And I think that's also what's really powerful. It's like the history component, but that you're bringing that to the table. You're explaining to people that, yes, this is in fact how it is. And that would make any sense, that should give people authority. And that's why, like, when we do our work, we try to find the person in the community to be the steward and help, really drive the good work that we want to do in a way that's like basically just supporting them. Like, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things that was hardest early on for me was being the center of the thing. These movements need a charismatic leader who's willing to be kind of punched in the groin and shoved around, right, and called stupid for a while. I mean, the first 3 or 4 years of the albino work, people said I was crazy to say that there will be a Black population here in 50 years. Like, they literally were like, this will never happen. And some of the most cynical people were from my own community, right? And so my second point is, once you tell everyone it's your canoe and they get into your canoe, then you have to be willing to be the leader. And that is really hard, right? That early leadership is a statement of vision. And women are dissuaded from being visionaries and saying, this is the way we need to go. So that the second thing for me was getting comfortable with that. And then the third was, in the canoe, people get in for different reasons. They can be in for different reasons, but sometimes you got to push them out of the canoe. And the pushing out is it usually is one reason, is that they're undermining your progress. So some people got into our canoe for Albina because they like architecture. Some people did it for social justice reasons. Some people did it because they wanted to program the waterfront. There are a few people on the team who are environmentalists and want us to focus on the river. My thinking was, I don't give a shit if you guys agree with the deepest of my motivations. As long as your oars are in the water and you're rowing in the direction I want you to row, I really don't care why. And so that's another thing that I think a lot of young leaders get wrong. They want the motivations of their fellow travelers to be theirs. No. When you're rowing, it doesn't matter why the person, they don't need to be your best friend. When you get to the other side of the river, you might not stay in the canoe together, but you got to get to the other side of the river. So that's the other thing I learned, is that let people join the movement and the work for whatever reason they want. Over time, they will gravitate toward, I think, those convergence toward purpose. And that certainly has been true for Albino. And then the last thing is, like, maybe 2 more things. As the charismatic leader, you have to be willing to get punched in the groin, and you also have to be willing to throw some punches. People punched me hard, and there's a gender component in our culture that's patrilineal but matrifocal, and hitting up against some of the roles that women typically play in leadership versus what I wanted to do. I had to get comfortable with that. And the last thing, I'd say number 5, is that all of these require money. And so I'm bringing the money.
I know that you also have the 1803 Fund. What's the difference between the 1803 Fund and the Albina Vision Trust?
Yeah, totally different organizations, although born out of a common nucleus. So Albina Vision is a nonprofit focused on the planning and redevelopment of Albina. The 1803 Fund is a fund. It's a financial institution focused on redeveloping Albina, but not just the physical cityscape, also the social infrastructure of the city. So as the community was dispersed and moved around, churches, our now have a geographic displacement with their congregations. We got kids whose families live in Vancouver, Washington, or Beaverton, who lie about their address so that they can go to school in the historic Black community. So that our social infrastructure was destroyed in addition to the community. So that needs reinforcement. So 1803 is a mix of philanthropy and conventional private investing. We'll be investing in real assets in the Albina neighborhood and sharing our profit in education, placemaking, and culture and belonging. So totally separate organizations. And to the extent that the two work together, we'll have to do it at an arm's length.
Okay. And when did you start the fund?
Technically, the entity was formed in February of 2023. The discussion about creating it started in April of 2020. Just as the pandemic started, I sat down to write the business plan for what would become 1803. Yeah.
And was it born out of, were you having trouble fundraising for the Albina Vision Trust? Is that where it was coming from, or what was?
No, there were two things I saw. Some of it was personal and some of it was technical. In doing the community investment plan for Albina Vision, it was clear we needed to bring capital to bear onto this plan. We couldn't just keep petitioning our electeds for public capital. We needed to bring the heat. So
is that what you had been doing up to there? You'd been getting public allocations for the projects that you'd been doing?
It was a combination of philanthropy and public capital. And the public capital was planning money, so it was like small money. But to really do this work, I could see that we need billions of dollars. I'd need to bring to bear billions of dollars. So that's when I started to think about it. I also was thinking, somebody should do this, or somebody really should do that, and somebody really needs to get to this. And I realized I was that somebody.
The bossy lady.
Yeah, because the thing that needed to happen was to take concepts of finance and apply them not just to home economics, but to a neighborhood. I mean, it's often difficult for people who have high finance training to double click down to the neighborhood level, mostly because it's not profitable. So people who had my job usually don't spend their free time doing Albina Vision type work, but because I love it so much, I did it. So anyway, I could see that I needed to bring to bear money, that I was probably the person who could bring the capital and laser focus it down to the neighborhood level. I feel like philanthropy, I felt like it could be so much more effective. And as the chief investment officer at one of the largest foundations in town that was run really thoughtfully, it still felt too conservative. And that behind closed doors, these institutions really are oriented toward the pile of money, not toward the community. And so I needed to find a mechanism that would deploy the capital into community and not spend the majority of my time protecting the pile of money, right? That was the difference, or hoarding the money. So I was thinking deeply about philanthropy and about investing, and I saw that we needed someone with my skill set and that we needed a lot.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Well, I guess one question is, how's it going so far?
It's harder than I thought. I was reluctant to step into the CEO seat. So in 1803, I'm the CEO. When I wrote the business plan, I wrote it with myself as the chief investment officer. I loved being a CIO, Decca. I loved it. It's amazing. I love moving capital around. I love having the big purse. It's fun. I didn't want to move out of that role. But Mr. Knight, when he committed the money, basically said, I'm not going to commit the money unless you step up.
And for those who don't know, who's Mr. Knight?
Mr. Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, who is also a Stanford Business School grad. I'm a Stanford Business School grad. But he basically said, I'm not funding this unless it's you. And I was like, nope, see you later. And then a few months passed and
Wait, you really said no?
No, I was like, no, I don't want to do this.
I love that. This is something Jack and I talk about all the time because, we're still in that small, scrappy nonprofit stage where we don't feel like we're in the position to say no to money. But that's really not how to think about it, because you can't take money that isn't aligned with with your values or what you're trying to do. And so I don't know. I'm always very inspired by people who say no to money. It's very hard for me to do.
Yeah, I just wanted. I didn't want. It was hard. I wasn't sure I wanted the smoke, to be honest. So I did some reflecting, and Phil basically said, nobody's ready, kid. We'll make you ready. And John Donahoe, the CEO of Nike, is going to be on your board, so he'll help you. Figure it out. And he just walked away. So it's going okay. I will say that it's starting something new is a massive challenge, right? From payroll to insurance to office setup, all of the operating details, copy machines. Where's a fax machine? We don't have a fax machine. What's our accounting policy? What's our compensation? I mean, oh my freaking God. So it's just so much, the operating stuff is a little bit overwhelming right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the place you're at right now.
That's where I am
figuring
right
it all out in the operational side.
We
Yeah.
believe in you, Rukaiyah.
So from my perspective, you're not making, you know, the work that you're doing, the work that we do to find and fund projects is not necessarily like an investment strategy, but I guess it could be.
It is. It is a strategy. And I think for people who are not involved in investing, what you don't see is the extraction of wealth from Black communities such that we can't afford to fund our own preservation work. That is the byproduct of a different investment strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That extractive effect is someone else's gain. But circling back to what I was saying earlier is that we are investing for profit here. So Mr. Knight, when he committed the money, basically said, I don't want to fund another endowment. I don't want money just to be sitting in some investment account. I got my own investors. And I'm getting older and I don't have time for talk. So he said, here's the money, but if you make profit on it, the profits can come back plus the original par, the original amount, they can come back into an endowed fund. But I don't want you just plopping the money down into, I want it activated in community. I want it to be translated into buildings and streets and ways that humans can engage. So he was actually pretty visionary in saying, you think you're such a great investor? Well, then do it for your own community. And if you succeed, then all of the success, all of my profits that normally flow back to him as the investor, instead he's giving the profits and the success from investing back to the community. So that's the piece I think people have a hard time understanding. And even more crazy, I am thinking about our grant-making work as just a part of the cost of investing. So instead of saying, philanthropy is just like, it's sweet, we're feeding orphans and widows. No, we're making grants in ways that make our investments more likely to succeed. And that breakthrough came, Decca, this is technical. So when I ran a bond fund, I used to run this $6.5 billion bond fund. And in order to mitigate the risk of interest rate fluctuations, we would buy interest rate swaps. So that basically meant you buy a bond and then you buy a swap and attach the swap onto the bond. The cost of the swap took your top side performance down a little because you have to pay for the swap. But the benefit of the swap is that you also won't lose on the downside. So it basically created a band of performance on your fund. Well, most communities don't see the work of nonprofits and social services as the equivalent of the interest rate swap. They think it's an expense, a standalone expense, and it's not. So if we are going to invest in affordable housing, that investment will more likely succeed if we also staple onto it some services for the people who live there, a streetscape that's safe, design that reflects, love and support and community. So I'm thinking of our philanthropic work as improving the likelihood of investment success.
I love this.
Love
that so much.
I just have to get a clarifying question here, because I'm not as familiar with the financial aspects in terms of the investment component. How exactly do people put money into a community-oriented project and then get a return? Like, what is exactly the return?
Yeah, so it could be both financial, quantitative, and qualitative. So we structured 1803 as a nonprofit corporation at the top, and the nonprofit owns a wholly owned subsidiary LLC at the bottom. So I'm agnostic about whether capital comes in as a charitable donation at the nonprofit level or comes in as an equity investment at the LLC level. It all comes in to me. It doesn't matter to me. And the reason why we wanted to set up this structure was that there's lots of money sitting in DAFs. I don't know if you've been watching what's happening, but wealthy people are building up all this money sitting in donor advised funds, and it's actually not moving out. And that's because most opportunities come to those people as charity. But in this case, if we invest in the redevelopment of Albina, there are capital assets in there that we could hold, multifamily housing. In the case of Lower Albina, there might be water rights. There could be rights of way if any government needed to pipe below the neighborhood. So there are all these real assets that you actually can hold and deliver a return on. So those folks who come in at the LLC level may be impact investors. Maybe they are just people who live in this community and want to invest. So that's how we've set up a system that doesn't fuss over the motivations of the capital. Again, I built this canoe. I don't really care why people are coming in. Just come on in because the canoe's going in the direction that I want it to go.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So let's talk about that then. So when I met you in 20, oh my gosh, time. 20, was it?
Before the pandemic.
Was it before the pandemic?
18.
Oh my
18,
God.
19.
Okay, fine. Before the pandemic. Okay, at that point, you kind of put together, I think, a proposal for what you wanted to see in Albina and the redevelopment. I think you had that you had started the Albina Vision Trust already. You had, I think, already hired Winta as your executive director. Winta, how did you pronounce her last name?
Johannes.
You'd already hired Winta Johannes as your executive director. But I don't think you had yet actually developed like the architectural renderings. You hadn't started getting the money together. So would you mind just basically catching me up?
Yeah, so the 5 things I mentioned before that helped me when we started with the canoe. Once we got going, there were some things I learned. And one of the important things I learned is you hire someone young and smart, you strengthen them, and then get out of the way. Like out of the way. Winta needed a pat on the back, a snack, and a little encouragement, and boy, did she take off. It was amazing. So in the ensuing period, we have developed a community investment plan, deep partnerships with our metro and regional and county governments in the planning of Albina. We've moved on from the initial community investment plan that was a high-level design. Now we're down to brass tacks, developing literally lot by lot in the area and choosing what will focus the first phase of development on north of Broadway. So we're down to brass tacks now. Also thinking about the ways that we've advanced, thinking about the ways that the work in Albina will benefit the broader city. And we think we should take on the river cleanup, moving that faster. So we've been fighting in the region for 40, 50 years on cleanup of the Superfund site, and it really hasn't moved. But there also haven't been populations of color in the discussion who come to the table with power. So we've made a lot of progress in thinking about the impact of environmental issues on albino and Black populations in general. I'd say the last 5 years, that's been the biggest focus for me. The freeway, which runs through the city, and understanding what diesel particulate and pollution does to the people who live around the freeway has sort of radicalized us and turned us into Black environmentalists. And then thinking about the Willamette River as a Superfund site, really almost all of the Black population of the state of Oregon recreates with the Willamette River in the Superfund area. Get this, even worse, when I was a kid in Portland, we actually didn't recreate in Albina on the river because that part of the city has been raised and lifted above the level of the river. There's a 30-foot difference between the edge of the river and the actual water. But where we would go are these shipping channels near where Vanport was. So Delta Park out there.
Yeah.
Kelly Point Park, those are shipping channels.
Yeah.
And so Black and brown children are kind of recreating and playing in these channels that are not designed for children in recreation. Every year someone would drown because of the undertow caused by ships moving through these systems and kids swimming out into shipping channels in a dangerous way. So the other thing I could see as an adult was that we cannot send working class Black and brown children to shipping channels to recreate. We've got to find a way to bring the river and its healthy care or its thoughtful care into the albino work. So the big jump is detail and now much more environmental advocacy than we had before.
Yeah, because I mean, like, as I mentioned, I guess as we kind of transitioned to this topic, that it's gonna be a challenge. It's not it has suffered. This area has suffered, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But that's a part of why we have an opportunity. So the other piece of this, gosh, Vanessa, you're making me realize this is actually a much more complex thought process for me. So I'm staying in Oregon, partially because I'm connected to it, but also because I believe the states with abundant natural resources, including water, for the next 50 years will be the wealthiest parts and most powerful parts of the country. As the South is too hot, for wealthy people to live, they'll migrate to places like this. And as an investor, what I saw in these big open spaces in Portland was opportunity. So I want to be clear, I'm no pussycat. And Albina is 90 acres on a wild and scenic river of the West, adjacent to downtown, on a highway system with a public transit center in it. And I'm no genius, but based on demography, climate change, and a bunch of other things, I thought, well, at some point, this part of the city will have to transform. And at that time, nobody wanted it. Nobody wants to deal with a big, super fun site plus a bunch of freeways and parking lots. And so that gave me the opportunity to stake claim to it. So what people saw as invaluable in 2018, I could see would be very valuable in 2028. And so a part of why we're even talking about it is because nobody wanted it. Nobody cared.
Yeah. Could you speak to the design aspect of the work? Because I'm curious about how you've taken those thoughts and have implemented them into the design for the future.
Yeah. So I think right around the time I met Vanessa, a few educators suggested that we look at the way the Marshall Plan was implemented in Europe post-World War II, particularly in Italy, where redevelopment of war-torn Italy was based on a concept that you should rebuild around the life of children. And what we saw in that year of study about how parts of the world that were destroyed, whether by natural or man-made causes, how they rebuilt, we went around looking at trying to figure out how do other communities do this? How can they be thoughtful? So the thing that we came out of that with was we need to rebuild this community around children. And I don't mean schools. Schools are a part of the lives of children in cities, but how do children navigate the city? Is a modern truck grill higher than a middle schooler who would have to cross an intersection on her way to school? So once we oriented our design thinking around the life of children, it changed the streetscape significantly. It meant that we'd have different setbacks for traffic. It meant that we would advocate for capping an open trench freeway in the neighborhood instead of merely creating a footpath across it. It meant that we would consider play areas as Portland densifies. We're thinking deeply about what happens to those children who live in that community. If we want affordable, dense housing, those kids will need outside spaces to recreate. So how can we create micro parks that are adaptable for children? So the focus on the life of Black children and expressing love to them in the urban form is at the center of all of the design work that Wenta and the rest of the team are doing at Albina Vision.
I love the way you're framing this because it makes me, it's like you just explained why I've always felt that urban planning and urban design and historic preservation are so intertwined. Is because within everything you're talking about in the design, there's an existing landscape. There's existing community voices, buildings, sites, And I think that that's just so incredible that thinking about this from the perspective of helping Black children have a better future really, I mean, it makes so much sense. And I also think that is also really smart in terms of finding funding, because people actually seem to, there's lots of groups out there that really want to fund things when they're centered around children. But it's like a no-brainer that the people that you need to think about are the younger
Yeah.
folks because they will grow up there.
Yeah, but it's funny. The urban form tells Black children that they are hated. The color of streetlights, blue spectrum lights, do not illuminate brown skin at night. They darken it. So the thing that we say should be lighting the street and creating safety, in fact, for Black boys in particular, and the darker your skin tone is, the more the effective that is, the greater the effect. Our street lighting isn't loving. Corner setbacks are not loving to children. They leave their schools and all of a sudden they got like a Ford 250 grill in front of them that's taller than them and proximate to them, moving fast right in front of them. We create housing spaces as they become dense that contain children rather than build spaces where they can live and learn and connect. Affordable housing, if you look at it, it's like, what is that? That's a container, right? It's maybe basic shelter, but certainly not designed to make children thrive in the urban environment. So there are all these ways that our design decisions, whether they're driven by cost or the primacy of the automobile, collectively, when you look at children in the city, they're not loved, and Black and brown children in particular are not just not loved, but they're actively put in danger.
Mm-hmm. I think about that all the time, especially when I cross a highway or something where it's just like, and because there's always more highways in the communities of color, and it's always like, this is not made for humans. This is not made for humans at all. It is so soul sucking to have to cross 7 lanes of scary traffic. And this is something, it's a theme that comes up again and again in our episodes. Like, how many episodes have we had, Decca, where we're talking to people and they're like, sorry, I can't even really hear you because there's all this car traffic going by or whatever it is. This is, the urban design can make you feel loved or make you feel hated.
Right. And I guess just like to that, the urban form was built by white people for white people. So I think it just makes a lot of sense to kind of come back now and be like, well, maybe if we address this, we can start making things more equitable.
Yeah, and I think ultimately I'm not sure that equitability is my goal. I want them to be unequal, and I want our biases to be clear. And that we have a bias toward youth, and we want it to be inequitably beneficial to Black and brown children. I want them to see themselves reflected in naming conventions for, fountains and places to gather and street names. I want them to understand the contributions that Black folks have made to our economy. So I'm not sure I want to get to equity.
Right. You want to see more thriving, more, this is my place, and this is our space.
Yeah, because we're talking about a physical space, but again, in Black history, we've been running and moving and stripped of indigeneity and tumbled to the east bank of the river. And the thing we can't have is that same kind of itinerancy. And to have that reflected not just in the household, but in the community, that means the monuments, buildings, and design have to reflect a more diverse population.
Can we also talk a little bit, because I think one of the reasons I talked to you the first time was because you were already then thinking about ways to bring wealth back to Black Portlanders in particular, who had been robbed of the opportunity. In your own family, you saw this. Your family home had been demolished to help create that stadium. to help create, that was a very positive way to put it. Yeah, it was demolished in order to create a stadium that was not for you, right? Your home was taken, or your family home was taken, and your family was denied that opportunity to have wealth accumulate over the generations, right? And so this is something that I know you were thinking about then. As you're imagining the redevelopment of Albina, how are you thinking about that now? How will the development of this neighborhood bring wealth back to Black Portlanders and allow them to start creating more wealth across generations?
And if it's okay, I would say you're also welcome to reflect back on that story that Vanessa was referencing if your family is important to the conversation.
Yeah, so when my great great grandmother arrived here, she rented an attic apartment in that neighborhood. So we were such new migrants at that time. We really didn't own any property until they moved in the next wave of gentrification to the next neighborhood near Killingsworth. But the short answer to the effect of the displacement on the Black community is we estimate about $1 billion of wealth was stolen from Black people and the Black community in the use of eminent domain to modernize Albina. I mean, the community
Can you say that number again?
We estimate it's about $1 billion
Wow.
in current value. And again, circling back to my earlier comment, coming home and seeing the community in new light, the deferred improvements on people's homes, the kind of shabby look of an underinvested community, well, that's because it's been stripped of wealth. With each push out further out from the city, an equivalent amount was essentially taken from the community. So it started with the $1 billion in Lower Albina, and I would guess the impact of the gentrification of North and Northeast Portland and the push for people to go further out, it's probably about the equivalent in terms of community wealth. So we've done our best to estimate what the number would be, and we know what it is. It's fucking staggering. It's staggering. Can you imagine this little Black community having $1 billion more of wealth, what that would mean for PTAs and,
Right.
Neighborhood cafes and bars. And so we know that was stolen from us essentially collectively.
$1 billion is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And that's when people say, oh, it's going to cost a lot to redo this. We're like, yeah, we know. We know it's going to cost. But so two things have happened. I think about wealth much more broadly now. So the financial piece of it is a big piece of it. But again, the access to the river and the ability to recreate and have clean air, that's a form of wealth. After the 2020 social justice protests, we know now that public safety is a form of wealth. So I've sort of expanded my thinking about wealth. But the one thing I want to be clear about in the work that we're doing in Albina is that we probably won't be able to directly benefit the people who were harmed. We won't be able to find, every family that got totally screwed over and make them whole. We won't be able to do that. But what we can do is strengthen, enrich, and root a Black community. That we can do. It just won't be the exact people who are harmed. And that's a really hard thing to say, but it's the truth. So we're doing a couple things to build wealth. The first is, before I left Meyer, we were experimenting with an affordable housing REIT. One of the problems with affordability and wealth accumulation for a Black population is that home ownership is, one, there are a bunch of intermediaries who do fucked up stuff. We already know about discrimination. Brokers, bankers, it's all messed up. But the structure for home ownership in a fee simple model, wherein a family puts a bunch of money down and then they take out a mortgage and pay the thing off over time, that manner of ownership is out of reach for many working class people, not just Black folks. So I started to think, is there another way that working people could hold a fractional interest in their community without it being a fee simple model that is intermediated by banks and brokers? And so we've been experimenting with a REIT concept so that working people can invest incrementally through their 401k or their IRA into real assets in their own community to help develop wealth. So they don't have to own the whole apartment, but they can own some shares of a REIT that holds the apartment building, for example.
Yeah. And if folks want to know, because we're running low on time, unfortunately, because we could talk to you for like another 3 hours, but if folks want to know about that REIT model, they can go back to that City of the Future episode, because we did end up talking about it quite a bit. it is very important when we're talking about inclusive development. I think a lot of people just think, oh, if it's diverse, it's inclusive. It's like, for me, my bar for inclusive development is that it has to be meaningfully impacting the people who live there so that they can hopefully generate wealth in the future and be able to stay there for the long term. And I think the fact that you're thinking about these things on these lines is very important to iterate, because it raises the bar on inclusive development projects across the country. So I just want to make sure that we say that and establish that. But yes, please continue, Rukaiyah.
Yeah, so there's that, and we're also doing something similar for corporate condos, so to speak, so that small businesses can begin to capitalize their balance sheets. And I'm really pushing philanthropy to endow Black serving organizations so that those organizations can buy capital assets, including buildings, and deeply root in a community. So I expect that we'll take those measures to help develop financial wealth, and that'll include some development agreements with the community and community benefit agreements as we start to develop it so that Black folks are hired in the construction work. But there's the financial piece, there's the access to nature piece that we think is a part of wealth. I expect that we will work with our local police force as we do the design work to see if police officers have something to say about making these environments feel safer for them and for children. So public safety is a form of wealth. And then, at some point, we will have to deepen relationships with some of the financial intermediaries. So we'll need a banking partner, maybe a brokerage partner, to try to get good people here and not have predators come and, take advantage of the folks who likely root in the communities that we redevelop.
Right. You don't want to recreate those historical wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I think it's like really impressive that you've been able to navigate the influx of money, how you manage it, it's so impressive. But like my first thought is like, for the people who are out there like trying to do projects like this, get money for preserving African American sites, for example, maybe let's say 5 African American sites in a particular community or city, and they're trying to get this fund together. What advice would you have for somebody like that?
Yeah, I think the money followed moral clarity about values. So we didn't start this work 8 years ago thinking that Phil Knight would understand all of this. By the way, he understands it. He grew up in East Portland, and the handshake to create Nike happened in Albina, so he knows the community. We started because we were focusing on what mattered to us and what we knew was right. And so I'd say start there. Like, you have to do the thing that resonates with your tuning fork. If your tuning fork's not vibrating when you do the work, it's not the right thing. 2, I find a lot of organizations struggle with scale. Like, they think it would be easier to ask for $1 million than it is to ask for $50 million, right? And that's the thing we got right in the Albina Vision work initially, was that we got the scale right, got the attention of big capital. For whether I like this or not, because Albina is centrally located in Portland, also people who are not Black or not connected to the historic community can see the ways they benefit. They benefit from a cleaned up river. They benefit from a green loop that goes through the community. They benefit from having more affordable housing so folks aren't living on the street. So I think that also helped. And maybe the thing that makes me squirm a little, but is probably true, is that I have a world-class education. In that education, I've learned to cross bridges and be in different rooms. I also have a network that is hard to understand. Mm-hmm. And I'm now seeing the benefit of that education. And it's both a stamp of trust. It gets me into rooms I wouldn't otherwise get into. The benefit of my education isn't just about my job. It's about the kinds of rooms that I get into at this point.
Wow.
Yeah. I also feel very conflicted about credentials. It's like you have to have them, but I hate that you have to have them, you know? Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to have them, but I feel okay about mine because I earn my shit, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the silver spoon that I eat with them. Like I
Right.
pay for that.
I mind that silver. Thank you very much.
Yes.
One thing we've been thinking about a lot is we think about this phrase equitable preservation-based development. So like just to give you a little context, since I've seen you in pre-pandemic times, like historic preservation wasn't on my radar. I understood history was important and that connecting history and real estate development practice was important, but I wasn't really thinking about the physical preservation of places. And the more that I've learned from Decca and working on this podcast, the more I've seen that there's so few physical places left for African Americans to point to, and not just African Americans, but other kind of more minority groups or underrepresented groups, that it is really important to save those places, and B, it is very important to tell the stories of the places, even if the physical remnants are no longer there, because that intangible also matters. And when I think about real estate development today, and I think about inclusive development, which is something I was thinking about back then when I was talking to you, and I'm still thinking about it now, I think about how can we preserve buildings in a way that is true to the historic fabric, whether it's physical or not, and develop so that people can be connected to that history now. And so for me, I think we talk about adaptive reuse a lot, because we're not saying that everything has to stay frozen in time exactly as it was, but there has to be some core of history that comes through to the present. And if that is a history of arts or culture or even housing, like making sure that whatever redevelopment is happening now is going to speak to that history and provide for the needs of the community today. So that's how I've been thinking about it, and I would just love to hear from your point of view what that phrase means to you, if it means anything at all, and if that's how you think about when you're thinking about redeveloping a historic neighborhood. Yeah, what is the lens through which you're seeing it?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Nothing we're talking about or proposing to build will be here in 250 years, right? Maybe, but not much of it. And so to the extent that the buildings contain the people who retell stories 250 years later and find a way to tell each other stories, I think is the key. And to the extent that historic preservation allows us to know ourselves and to know our history better, to engage with it across generation, that's what we want to achieve. That preservation work is somewhat important for the populations who live with those buildings that have been preserved, but I think it's probably more important to humanity over time. That's how we connect to each other and to our history. Now, with that said, the United States, this is an issue for the United States writ large. We're a young, scrappy, and hungry country, right? And there are very few parts of the country that actually have been around long enough and have been preserved well enough to have that be a part of the DNA as it is, say, in parts of Europe. I mean, there's like parts of Pennsylvania, maybe some buildings in Ohio. But on the West Coast, the climate just over 200 years just strips down whatever construction happened here. So I think the key is to adaptively reuse enough to visually remind us of our connection to the past, to engage with our collective history and future. That's the key, is to engage the human population in togetherness. And the reason why having Black history wiped out of the kind of built inventory or portfolio of the country is a problem is that Black folks are going to be here in the future, right? We're here in the past. And if we are not smoothing the memory over time, we start to abuse each other and undervalue each other. So I think there's the built environment is a memory book of human experience that we need to visually engage with, not just narratively. So that's what's on my mind about adaptive reuse and thinking about what will be here. I mean, I went to what's that town in Pennsylvania? Like a little town where people live in 200 or 300-year-old houses. And when you're in one of those houses that's 300 years old in the early American settlements, you can't help but be transported to early American history or some parts of Boston, for example.
Mm-hmm. Some of the earliest buildings in American history are there. German folks in Pennsylvania building their very unique barns and stone structures. The people who were building their brick townhouses in Boston. Though there's a reason why there are areas of Boston like that are historic districts because of this collective memory that people have to these places and the architecture.
Yeah, and you can have whatever feelings you have about Boston writ large, but when your body is engaging in that environment, you are transported. You're connected to it some way or another. And I think that's the thing that's ahead of us. And it runs counter to, I think, American culture of sort of disposability, a kind of disdain for the far history. But we, in our work at Albina Vision, took cues from Berlin, where, the monumenting of what happened there was almost painful accuracy. You have to engage with it. Or Oslo, the Oslo Opera House, which tumbles into a waterway. And the placement of that opera house forces you to think about the water, to think about the connection of Northern Europeans and Scandinavians to seafaring. So I think it is really important, but the importance isn't in the brick and mortar. It's in the bone and the tendon and the memory.
Right. No, I feel you there. It's just like it's so interesting that the preservation community focuses so much on the tangible when the collective memory is definitely what I want to value and be able to continue to strip out of sites and places.
And I think in this particular case, because when we started this conversation kind of talking about the river and the flood, I think as much as the built environment is going to be a beautiful reflection of the history, I also think that the reknitting of a connection to the water and the way that nature is going to be reclaimed, rehabilitated on this site, I think is also a callback to potentially kind of indigenous histories, right? And like the way the land was before we kind of put industry in a way that was, as you said, put it, Rukaiyah, evil to the river, right? And that is also a part of the reconnection. And in that case, it's not even necessarily, I mean, it will kind of be actually of the physical recreation. It might not be buildings, but it's going to be the landscaping. It's going to be the urban design. It's going to be a way of building on the land that is light and in communication with the river. And I think that's also a strong reflection of the history of the site as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't believe that we can want to heal the river and how we regard it without wanting to heal our communities and how we regard them. I don't. You cannot do those in isolation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think the river and the community and the built environment and the intermediation between the built environment and the river, that's where the seam is where there will be lots of exciting opportunities.
Thank you, Rukaiyah. This was awesome as always. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.
Yes, and can we talk again in a year when 1803 is, full blast and
anytime you want to talk.
Yes, we would love to talk. You were so impressive. So I mean, you might know that, and also whatever. But thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this Urban Roots episode, and a huge thanks to Rukaiyah Adams, Chief Executive Officer of the 1803 Fund. Your hosts are me, Deqa Hussein Wetzel,
and me, Vanessa Quirk. This episode was edited and mixed by the brilliant Connor Lynch.
You can find us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture or email us at urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com.
If you don't know this already, Urban Roots is a part of the nonprofit that Deqa founded and that I'm a part of called Urbanist Media. Our mission is to elevate underrepresented voices and ensure the places significant to them are preserved.
Yeah, y'all, podcasting takes dedication, which we have plenty of, but it also takes money.
Right. And we could really use your help in supporting the production of the Urban Roots podcast and especially these episodes on Vanport. So if you are a fan of us and you believe these stories need to be told, please consider donating to our nonprofit Urbanist Media on PayPal or Venmo at Urbanist Media. That is a tax-deductible donation because we're a legit nonprofit.
Yes, we are. 501c3
Yes, we are.
and everything.
All right, Decca, you want to hit the good people with our tagline?
Yes, ma'am. Urban Roots, looking back so we can move forward.